A British officer with two broken legs, barely able to stand, hobbling on wooden crutches, was heading toward a German panzer tank. Not away from it, toward it. The Germans inside that tank had machine guns. They had armor. They had every advantage a soldier could ask for. And they watched this crippled man approach, and they ran. Not retreated. Ran. Left the tank. Fled into the woods like they'd seen a ghost. What did this officer know that made an entire tank crew abandon their vehicle? What did he do that terrified, battle-hardened German soldiers more than bullets ever could? This is the true story of the most insane psychological warfare in World War II. Let me show you exactly what happened. Before I tell you about the crutches and the tank, you need to understand something about the man holding those crutches. His name was Major Robert Henry Kahin. Born September 2nd, 1909, in Shanghai, China, the son of a British merchant who worked in the Far East. From the moment he could walk, Robert Kahin was different. Not bigger than the other kids. Not stronger. Not particularly athletic. But absolutely, completely, terrifyingly fearless. There's a story from his childhood that his mother used to tell. When Robert was 7 years old, a stray dog, a big, mean, half-wild thing, cornered his younger sister in the garden. The dog was snarling, teeth bared, ready to attack. Most 7-year-olds would have run for help. Robert picked up a garden rake, walked directly toward the dog, and stared it down until it whimpered and ran away. When his mother asked him later if he was scared, Robert looked at her with genuine confusion. Why would I be scared? It was just a dog. I'm a person. Dogs should be scared of people. That was Robert Kahin at 7. Imagine what he was like at 35 with military training and 2 wars under his belt. Kahin joined the British Army in 1928 at the age of 19. He wasn't escaping poverty or running from trouble. His family was comfortable, educated, and respectable. He joined because he wanted to, because something in him needed the structure, the challenge, the opportunity to test himself against impossible situations. He served in various postings throughout the 1930s, including time in India and other corners of the British Empire. By the time World War II erupted in 1939, Kahin was already a seasoned officer with a reputation for 2 things: absolute calm under pressure and a tendency to do things that made his superiors simultaneously furious and amazed. There's a report from his commanding officer dated 1941 that reads, in part, Major Kahin possesses tactical instincts that border on the supernatural. He also possesses a complete disregard for personal safety that borders on the suicidal. I cannot decide if he is the best officer in my command or the most dangerous. Possibly both. That assessment would prove prophetic in ways nobody could have imagined. By 1944, Robert Kahin had been transferred to the 2nd Battalion, South Staffordshire Regiment, which was part of the 1st Airborne Division. If you know anything about World War II, you know what that means. Paratroopers, the men who jumped out of perfectly good airplanes to land behind enemy lines, surrounded by Germans, expected to hold impossible positions until relief arrived. These were not normal soldiers. These were men who had volunteered to do the most dangerous job in the entire military. And even among these men, Robert Kahin stood out. His fellow officers described him as pathologically brave, a term that sounds like a compliment, but was actually meant as a warning. Kahin didn't just accept danger. He seemed to actively seek it out, as if testing some private theory about the limits of human courage. One lieutenant who served under him put it this way: Major Kahin didn't believe in impossible situations. He believed that every situation had a solution, and the only question was whether you were smart enough and brave enough to find it. The problem was his solutions usually involved walking directly toward whatever was trying to kill us. September 1944. Operation Market Garden. If you've seen the movie A Bridge Too Far, you know this operation. If you haven't, here's the short version. The Allies came up with an audacious plan to end the war by Christmas. They would drop thousands of paratroopers behind German lines in the Netherlands, capture a series of bridges, and create a highway for Allied tanks to race straight into Germany. It was bold, it was brilliant, and it was a disaster. The intelligence was wrong. The Germans were stronger than expected. The relief forces were slower than planned. and thousands of British paratroopers found themselves trapped in a town called Arnhem, surrounded by German armor, running out of ammunition, waiting for help that might never come. Robert Kahn was one of those paratroopers, and Arnhem would become the place where he transformed from an excellent officer into a legend. The drop itself went wrong from the beginning. Kahn's unit was supposed to land in a specific zone, regroup quickly, and advance toward the bridge. Instead, they were scattered across miles of Dutch countryside, landing in fields, forests, and in some cases, directly onto German positions. Kahn landed harder than he should have. His parachute caught a crosswind at the last moment, swinging him sideways into a tree. He hit a branch, then another, then slammed into the ground at an angle that should have killed him. It didn't kill him, but it shattered his left ankle and cracked 2 bones of his right leg. Any normal soldier would have been evacuated, would have called for a medic, gotten stabilized, and been shipped back to England for months of recovery. Robert Kahn was not a normal soldier. He looked at his legs, already swelling, already turning colors that legs should not turn, and made a decision. He would not be evacuated. He would not leave his men. He would find some crutches, strap on his sidearm, and continue the mission. The medic who examined him thought he was joking. "Sir, you can't walk. You literally cannot put weight on either leg." Kahn smiled. It was not a reassuring smile. "Then I won't walk. I'll hobble. Now find me some crutches and point me toward the Germans." The next 9 days were hell. Pure, unrelenting, apocalyptical. The British paratroopers at Arnhem were surrounded, outgunned, and slowly being destroyed. German tanks rolled through the streets. German infantry pushed from every direction. Buildings burned. Ammunition ran low. And through it all, Major Robert Kahn, on crutches, in constant pain, unable to run or take cover quickly, fought like a demon possessed. He organized defensive positions. He directed fire. He personally destroyed German tanks using a PIT, a spring-loaded anti-tank weapon that was notoriously unreliable and had to be fired from close range. How close? About 100 yards. Sometimes less. Imagine hobbling on crutches toward a 45-ton German tank, knowing that you have to get within spitting distance before your weapon will even work. Imagine doing that not once, but multiple times, over 9 days, with broken legs. That was Robert Kahn at Arnhem. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the specific moment. The crutches, the tank, the fleeing Germans. That would become the most famous story of his career. It happened on the 5th day of the battle, September 21st, 1944. By this point, Kahn's unit had been pushed back to a defensive perimeter around a church. They were running low on everything: ammunition, food, medical supplies, and hope. The Germans had brought up reinforcements, including several panzer tanks that were systematically destroying what remained of the British positions. One particular tank had been causing problems all morning. It had taken position on a road about 300 yards from the church, and it was using its main gun to demolish buildings one by one. Every few minutes, there would be an explosion, and another piece of cover would disappear. The British had no anti-tank weapons left in that sector. No peecha, no grenades that could penetrate armor, nothing that could touch a panzer from 300 yards. The commanding officer of that sector, a captain named Williams, was describing the situation to Kahn when he arrived on his crutches. "We're finished, sir. That tank is going to destroy the church within the hour. We've got nothing that can stop it. I'm recommending we abandon the position." Kahn listened, nodded, looked at the tank in the distance, and then said something that made Captain Williams question his sanity. "I'm going to go get that tank." Williams stared at him, looked at the crutches, looked at the tank, looked back at Kahn. "Sir, with the greatest respect, that's insane. You can't walk. You have no anti-tank weapons. What exactly are you planning to do? Limp at them aggressively?" Kahn smiled. That smile again. The one that made people nervous. "Captain, in my experience, the most dangerous weapon in any battle isn't a gun or a tank or a bomb. It's psychology. Those Germans in that tank, they've been winning all day. They feel invincible, and that's exactly what makes them vulnerable." Williams still didn't understand. Kahn didn't bother explaining further. He simply said, "Hold this position. I'll be back in 20 minutes with a tank." And then he started hobbling toward the German lines. What happened next has been reconstructed from multiple eyewitness accounts. British soldiers watching from the church, Dutch civilians hiding in nearby buildings, and remarkably, one German soldier who survived the war and gave an interview in 1972 about that day. The accounts don't all agree on every detail, but they agree on the important parts. And those parts are almost impossible to believe. Kahn moved slowly. He had to. With 2 damaged legs and wooden crutches, there was no other option. But he moved directly, openly, making no attempt to hide or take cover. He simply hobbled down the main road toward the tank in full view of everyone. The German tank crew saw him coming. Of course they did. He was an officer in uniform, moving toward them in broad daylight. They could have killed him at any moment. One burst from the machine gun, and he would have been cut in half. But they didn't fire. And that's where the psychology begins. Put yourself in the position of that German tank crew for a moment. You've been fighting for days. You're winning. The British are falling back everywhere. And then you see this. A single British officer, clearly injured, on crutches, walking directly toward your tank. Not running, not hiding, not even moving particularly fast. Just approaching, with absolute calm, like he knows something you don't. What do? The logical thing would be to shoot him. He's an enemy. He's approaching your position. Pull the trigger. Simple. But humans aren't logical creatures, especially in combat. And what the German crew was seeing didn't fit any pattern they understood. Enemies run. Enemies hide. Enemies attack in groups with weapons drawn. They don't hobble directly toward tanks like they're going for a morning stroll. The German commander, according to the 1972 interview, told his crew to hold fire. He wanted to see what this madman was doing. Maybe he was surrendering. Maybe he was a messenger. Maybe there was some trick they needed to understand before they could counter it. So they watched. And Kahn kept coming. At about 150 yards, Kahn stopped. He was close enough now that the tank crew could see his face clearly. Could see that he wasn't afraid. Could see that he was smiling. And then he did something that changed everything. He raised one of his crutches and pointed it at the tank. Like a weapon. Like he was aiming it. And he started shouting in German. Kahn spoke German. Fluently. He had learned it as a young officer, knowing that language was a weapon just as surely as any rifle. And now he used that weapon. Attention, tank crew. You are surrounded. British forces have flanked your position. You have 30 seconds to exit the vehicle and surrender, or you will be destroyed. This was, of course, a complete lie. There were no flanking forces. There was no support coming. There was just one injured man on crutches, bluffing for his life. But the German crew didn't know that. Here's what they didn't know. Something was wrong. No officer approaches a tank alone unless he has a reason. No injured man walks toward death unless he knows something. And this man, this calm, smiling, German-speaking British officer, was pointing something at them and telling them they were surrounded. What if it were true? What if there were anti-tank positions behind them that they hadn't spotted? What if this officer was the bait, meant to keep them focused forward while death approached from behind? The tank commander made a decision. He would not risk his crew on uncertainty. He ordered everyone out of the tank. They would retreat on foot, assess the situation, and return with infantry support. They opened the hatches, climbed out, and started running toward the German lines. Kahn watched them go, waited until they were out of sight, and then, on his crutches, he hobbled up to the tank, climbed inside, and started the engine at 23 minutes after leaving the church. Major Robert Kahn returned to British lines, driving a German panzer tank, by himself, on crutches. Captain Williams, who had watched the whole thing through binoculars, couldn't speak for almost a full minute. When he finally found words, all he could manage was, "Sir." Kahn shrugged. Psychology, Captain. They expected a threat they could understand. I gave them one they couldn't. When people encounter something that doesn't fit their mental model of the world, they freeze. Or they run. Those Germans ran. Williams shook his head. But you were bluffing. You had nothing. No weapons, no backup, nothing. They didn't know that. And by the time they figured it out, it was too late. Kahn climbed out of the tank carefully, painfully, his legs screaming at him, and handed the keys to a stunned private. Get someone who knows how to use this thing. We got a position to defend. But that wasn't the end of Robert Kane's day, or his week, or his legend. With the captured tank now serving as part of the British defensive line, Kane continued fighting. The Battle of Arnhem would rage for 4 more days, and Kane would be at the center of it the entire time. He destroyed multiple German tanks with PIT weapons, always from gallantry, endless determination, and remarkable leadership during 9 days of close combat with enemy tanks and self-propelled guns were beyond praise. He showed coolness and bravery that inspired all who saw him. But the official citation doesn't mention the crutches and the tank. That story was too strange, too unbelievable, too dependent on eyewitness testimony that sounded like fiction. It was included in informal accounts, passed down through military channels, and told at veterans' gatherings for decades. But it didn't make the official record. Some things are just too impossible to document. What actually happened in those 23 minutes? What was going through Kane's mind as he hobbled toward that tank? And why did his bluff work so perfectly? Let me break it down, because there's a lesson here that goes far beyond military history. The key to understanding Kane's success is understanding what the German tank crew expected. They expected a rational opponent, someone who would weigh the risks, calculate the odds, and act accordingly. A rational opponent would never approach a tank alone, on crutches, without weapons. It would be suicide. Therefore, the Germans reasoned, this officer must know something they didn't. He must have backup, must have a plan, must be the visible part of a larger trap. The moment they started reasoning from that premise, they had already lost. This is what psychologists call the madman theory of negotiation. If you convince your opponent that you're irrational, that you're willing to do things that make no logical sense, they can no longer predict your behavior. And if they can't predict you, they can't counter you. They're forced to make decisions based on fear rather than analysis. And fear is a terrible strategist. Richard Nixon famously used this approach during the Cold War, trying to convince the Soviets that he was unstable enough to actually use nuclear weapons. But Robert Kane didn't learn it from books or theories. He learned it from experience. He understood, instinctively, that courage can be its own weapon. That sometimes the most effective thing you can do is exactly what your opponent thinks is impossible. There's another element to this story that often gets overlooked. Kane wasn't just brave. He was theatrical. He understood that perception matters as much as reality in combat. When he pointed his crutch at the tank like a weapon, he was staging a performance. When he shouted in German about non-existent flanking forces, he was creating a narrative. He gave the German tank crew a story that made sense, a story about a clever British trap. And they believed it because the alternative was too strange to process. In other words, Kane didn't just bluff. He gave his opponents a face-saving reason to retreat. The German commander didn't run from a crippled man with no weapons. He made a tactical decision to withdraw from a sophisticated ambush. That's what he told himself. That's what he told his superiors. And that's why the story worked. If Kane had simply approached and demanded surrender without the elaborate fiction, the Germans might have called his bluff. They might have noticed that no reinforcements were materializing, no anti-tank weapons were visible, no trap was springing. But by giving them a plausible threat, one that aligned with their training and expectations, Kane made retreat feel like wisdom rather than cowardice. Let's talk about what happened after the war. Robert Kane returned to civilian life in 1946. He had a wife, Frances, whom he had married in 1940. They had a daughter together, and for the next several decades, Kane lived a remarkably quiet life. He worked in various business ventures. He raised his family. He attended veterans events and memorial services, and he almost never talked about Arnhem. When asked about his Victoria Cross, he would change the subject. When pressed about the crutches and the tank, he would smile that same smile and say something dismissive. I just did what seemed sensible at the time. Sensible. That was his word for approaching a tank alone, on broken legs, and convincing the crew to abandon it through sheer force of will. Sensible. His daughter, Frances, gave an interview in 2012 about growing up with a Victoria Cross winner for a father. He never spoke about the war, she said. Not the battles, not the medal, not any of it. I didn't even know he had won the Victoria Cross until I was a teenager and found it in a drawer. When I asked him about it, he just said, "That was a long time ago, love. It doesn't matter now." But it didn't matter. The men who served with him made sure of that. Every year, on the anniversary of Arnhem, survivors of the battle would gather. And every year, someone would tell the story of the crutches and the tank. It became part of the mythology of the operation, one of the few bright spots in what was otherwise a tragic failure. Cain would attend these gatherings when his health allowed. He would listen to the stories. He would shake hands with old comrades. And occasionally, very occasionally, he would add a detail that no one else knew. One such detail came out at a 1975 reunion. Cain was in his mid-60s by then, slowing down, knowing that these gatherings would not continue forever. Someone asked him for the 100th time why he had really gone after that tank. What was he thinking? Cain was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that the men who heard it would repeat for the rest of their lives. "I was thinking about my father. When I was a boy, he told me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the..." Concluded with these words. Robert Cain was not a complicated man. He believed in duty. He believed in his comrades. And he believed that any situation, no matter how hopeless, could be overcome with sufficient courage and creativity. He proved that belief at Arnhem, and he lived it every day afterward. We will not see his like again. The congregation said amen. And somewhere in whatever afterlife awaits men like Robert Cain, a German tank crew was probably still running. But here's the thing about this story that most people miss. The crutches and the tank, that's the dramatic moment, the part that makes for good storytelling. But it's not the most impressive thing Robert Cain did at Arnhem. Not even close. The most impressive thing was what he did every other hour of those 9 days. The steady, unglamorous, exhausting work of keeping his men alive. The decisions about where to position defenses. The calculations about how to stretch limited ammunition. The midnight conversations with terrified soldiers, reassuring them that they would see home again. The willingness to stand, or rather, lean on crutches at the most dangerous points of the line, showing his men that he would not ask them to face anything he wouldn't face himself. That's what earned him the Victoria Cross. Not one moment of theatrical bravery, but 9 days of relentless leadership under impossible conditions. There's a tendency in our culture to celebrate the dramatic moment. The single act of heroism that changes everything. But real courage usually looks different. It looks like showing up again and again, doing the hard thing over and over, making the right choice when no one is watching and no medals are being given out. Robert Cain understood this. That's why he never talked much about the tank. It was a good story, yes. But in his mind, it was just one decision among hundreds. Just one moment in a very long week. The real victory at Arnhem wasn't captured tanks or killed enemies. It was the fact that when the survivors finally retreated across the Rhine, they retreated as soldiers. They retained their discipline, their honor, their sense of themselves as a fighting unit. And that was largely because of leaders like Cain, who refused to let the disaster break their spirit. What can we learn from this man on crutches who terrified German tank crews? What's the lesson that applies to our lives, here and now, without the panzers and the paratroopers and the life or death stakes? I think it comes down to this. Your disadvantages can become your advantages. Your limitations can become your weapons. But only if you're willing to do what everyone else considers impossible. Robert Cain couldn't run, couldn't take cover quickly, couldn't move like a soldier is supposed to move. So he did something else. He used his immobility, his visibility, his obvious vulnerability as psychological weapons. He made the Germans ask themselves, why is this man approaching? What does he know? What trap are we walking into? And in their hesitation, their confusion, their fear of the unknown, he found his victory. The same principle applies everywhere. The entrepreneur who has no money learns to be creative in ways that rich competitors never consider. The student who struggles with traditional learning develops alternative skills that straight-A students lack. The athlete with physical limitations discovers techniques and strategies that naturally gifted players overlook. The obstacle becomes the way. The weakness becomes the weapon. But only if you're willing to do what Robert Cain did. Look at your situation honestly, accept what you cannot change, and then find a way forward that no one else would consider. Most people, facing what Cain faced, would have accepted defeat, would have let the medics evacuate them, would have watched the battle from a hospital bed, safe and helpless.